Hi, this is Pastor Don Shipley. I'm pleased and delighted to have a friend and colleague, Geoff Helton, here to talk about the Old Testament. Geoff, could you please introduce yourself?
Sure, Don, I'd be glad to. So my name is Geoff Helton, and I serve as lead pastor at Audubon Park United Methodist Church in Spokane, Washington.
Mhm.
But in addition to being a pastor, I also am an adjunct professor at Whitworth University, where I teach theology courses, mostly Old Testament courses and a few New Testament courses.
The Old Testament is frankly old. So why do people still study it today? Is it a relic or is it still alive?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of churches, a lot of Christians that tend to ignore or even actively avoid the Old Testament. And there's some reason for that. Any ancient document, even the New Testament, is so far removed from us, it can seem foreign, almost like a totally different world.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, there's still human beings, struggling to understand God's will, struggling to be in relationship with God, and struggling to make their way in the world. And so it's my belief, and it's been the belief of people of faith for centuries, that we can learn from the stories of these ancient peoples who were trying to make their way, and we can learn and gain insight as we seek to do the same.
But the funny thing is that there are churches that pride themselves as being strictly New Testament churches.
Yeah. So to me, the scriptures are Old and New Testament, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are one big story.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a story that begins really with the calling of Abraham from his homeland to journey to the promised land. It continues through the early patriarchs and matriarchs of the people of Israel, through the prophets, through the kings, to Jesus and the early disciples. And when we just read the New Testament and we say we're a New Testament church and that's it, we cut off a major part of the beginning of the story, and we assume that the story has ended and it doesn't continue with us.
And what you're also adding is that though there are no more pages being added to the scriptures, the narrative continues.
It does. We're a part of the story of faith.
What kind of students typically enroll in your classes on the Old Testament? What are they looking for? What are they hungering for?
As an adjunct, I get sometimes courses that just need to be taught. And so some of the courses I teach, like I teach a course on life and teachings of Jesus. That's a very introductory course. All students at Whitworth University are required to take one biblical literature course. But I also teach some courses that are required for the theology major. So I teach an Old Testament theology course. Some just want to be educated, engaged lay people.
You told me prior to this interview that the Old Testament could say a thing or two to us today as we are working our way through this pandemic and so on. And it's clear that there's no doubt that the Old Testament is littered with stories of crises and disasters and tragedies of every kind. Can you name a few?
Oh, for sure. So two of the big ones in the life of Israel are the story of the Exodus. Mm-hmm. So the Hebrew people being enslaved in Egypt and having to win their freedom from Egypt, God saving them and redeeming them. And the second big one is the story of exile, which I hope we'll talk about some more later on, because this is the place where I see some strong parallels between the big disruption happening in our life right now, the pandemic, and the history of Israel. Yeah, those are two big ones, but there are so many smaller ones.
Yeah, tell me some of the smaller, minor stories.
Oh, I mean, there's just so many. If you think of the book of Psalms, the Psalms are made up of songs of praise and psalms of lament. Mm-hmm. And laments come from times of crisis and times of difficulty. And there are more laments in the book of Psalms than there are praises.
There was plenty of cause for despair.
Yeah. crisis, disruption, difficulty, these are the normal things of life. They happen. One of the things I see value about the Old Testament is that we can learn about how people have dealt with those in the past, specifically people of faith.
That seems to be what I often summarize the Old Testament, talk about. There's these cycles. There's disaster and despair and lament, and then there's recovery and restoration, and then back into the descent into chaos again.
Yeah.
Is that about a good characterization of much of the Old Testament?
Yeah, in fact, there's a Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who's fairly famous, and he describes a cycle called disorientation, which would be the chaos and the difficulty, reorientation, which is coming out of that, into kind of a new orientation, a new kind of stable place in life, and that our life moves between those three phases.
Let's get back to the exile.
If you may or may not know, Don was telling me before, he's a geography major. Yes. Well, the geography of Israel plays a big part in their history.
Yeah.
And Israel is a fairly small nation among several other small nations that are right in between two major world powers. Mesopotamia in the north. So this is the Assyrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Persian Empire. And then to the south, Egypt. And so Israel's in this, like, right in the warpath between these two major powers. And whenever they wanted to, battle each other, they had to go through Israel.
Israel was the battleground for many of these conflicts.
It was. And so in around the year 722, the Assyrians come down from the north and conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. By this time, the kingdom of Israel had split in two, and there was kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. And they carry off a large number of the people to the north. A couple hundred years later, in the year 586, the Babylonians come down and they destroy the southern kingdom. And they do the same thing. They utterly destroy the city of Jerusalem. They destroy the Holy Temple. And they carry off all of the leaders of the people. So all the merchants, all the rich folks, all the government officials, the priests, all of the leadership, they carry them off to Babylon. And they bring new people into Israel. And this was a major, major disruption in the life of Israel and in the faith of Israel. They had always believed that God was on their side, that God was protecting them and watching over them. And so it really caused a crisis of faith. How do we make sense of the fact that we are God's chosen people, and yet God has somehow allowed the Babylonians to conquer us, to destroy the holy city, the holy temple, and carry off our leaders?
Right. So it sounds like a profound betrayal.
Yeah, it does. It really disrupted their whole way of life. So yeah, there's a lot of adjustment, a lot of changes that have to happen for them.
It sounds interesting. They had to come up with theological fixes and make do's to be able to function and operate.
Very much so. And so each of the prophets, so there's a number of prophets speaking for God at this point, and all of them, point to different reasons why this has happened and what the people need to do to get through it. And probably, the one that I felt drawn to the most as I thought about pandemic was the prophet Jeremiah, because his ministry really stretches from before the exile to during to even after. His message kind of covers that whole time. And so, for Jeremiah, he has some really strong life lessons for us that helped the people in their time and can help us now.
And so, of course, it leads us to the next question, which is, what are those lessons? Can you enumerate those, please?
I can. So I'll be honest, our church did a whole 7-week sermon series on this.
Yeah, so why don't you just sum it up in 10 minutes, please?
Of course. So one of those lessons is a story from Jeremiah. There was a prophet named Hananiah who is telling the people, oh, this is just a small blip, not a big deal. Like
A tiny disruption.
Tiny disruption. This is going to be over, sooner than you think. Just hold on, don't settle down. God's going to restore us to Israel right away. And Jeremiah has to speak up and say, no, this is gonna be a while. Jeremiah tells the people, no, you should settle down. He says, plant gardens. Your kids should marry. You're gonna be here for a while.
Which is not exactly a human tendency or quality to be patient.
But when we shortcut things and we try and just get around it, oftentimes it never goes away, right? It'll show up again somewhere else.
What's the next lesson?
Another lesson from the exile is, yes, we have to journey through the disruptions of life, exiles and pandemics, but that God walks with us through them, and that it's God's hope to bring us out of them. And so there's this really famous verse from Jeremiah 29. I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and give you peace. So yes, calamity happens, crisis happens, but God walks with us through it all, and it's God's plan to bring us out of it. The Hebrew people were doubting that during exile, right? They kind of felt like God had abandoned them. And so one of Jeremiah's messages was, you might not see God at work, but God is working and God is with you.
Next lesson.
So one of the last lessons is, that eventually disruptions end. And oftentimes, and this is a strong parallel I saw between the pandemic and Jeremiah. When the exile began, it wasn't as though it all just started at once. There were waves of people that were exiled to Babylon.
That's right.
And when they came back from exile, there were waves of people returning. And so scholars actually have a hard time nailing down exactly when the exile happened. And I see a lot of parallels between that and what people are saying is going to be true about the pandemic. I read an article a few months ago that talked about how there will be no clear end to the pandemic. There's not going to be this moment where it's announced, all right, the pandemic's over.
That's right. Everybody's cured. We're all good now.
And so the ending of the pandemic, it will look different for different people. As each of us feels, comfortable or not comfortable doing certain things, as people get the vaccine, right? You're going to feel more willing to do some things. And so one of the lessons of the exile was, yes, God has a future, a hopeful future in mind for us. But God also plans on us doing a lot of the work to build the future. And so when the people returned, it's not as though they arrived at a, beautiful city of Jerusalem that was, exactly as they had left it. No, it had been utterly destroyed. And so they had to do the work of rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city walls. So we will have to rebuild the future after the pandemic. And to me, that's hopeful, because it means that we get, if we're careful, we can rethink, if I'm rebuilding my life, we get to ask the question, what do we want to prioritize?
That's the positive side of it. The other side, however, is that there was some despair over and feeling beleaguered that things wouldn't return to be the same. The temple would not be the shining example as it was before. It'll be a little more modestly constructed and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so and I think this is one of the lessons that I skipped because we didn't have time. But there is no returning to normal there's only building a new one. You know, Jerusalem was never going to be the same.
Yeah.
And the temple was never going to be the same. But it could be good again. It could even be great again.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true in our lives.
Yeah.
You know, we can't wind back the clock. So we have to ask the question, you know, what from our past do we really want to maintain? What do we need to bring forward to us with us now? What from our recent experience of pandemic do we want to hold on to? So for example, for me, I've found that with so much shut down,
Mm-hmm.
I'm spending more time with my family
Sure.
than I ever have before. And I don't want to give that up. And so as I rebuild my life, I'm going to make sure that family is more of a priority than it was before the pandemic.
I was thinking about a modern corollary, like for instance, cities that were bombed in World War II, they had to be rebuilt.
Yep.
They couldn't put everything back together brick by brick and board by board, but they had to decide what essence, what character do they want to restore, and
Yeah.
what they have to leave behind.
Yeah.
Is that
I mean,
a reasonable parallel?
oh, for sure. I mean, another one from our personal lives is again the loss of a loved one,
Sure.
right? When you lose someone you love, so much of your life is built intertwined with someone else,
Right.
and when you lose that person, uh, there's a lot of rebuilding that has to be done.
Yeah.
And so you have to think about what are the things that I'm really going to focus on, and and hopefully our experience of grief changes us so that we recognize our priorities.
Right.
You know, so many, you know, as a pastor, working with families through funerals and gravesides, and I'm sure you've experienced this too.
Mm-hmm.
So many families, once they experience the loss of someone they love, draw a lot closer to each other than they were before. And I think that's beautiful.
Given your expertise on things Old Testament, what about disease
Yeah.
and pestilence and so on and so forth? What kind of experiences did they have, and how do they find treatments for their various conditions and ailments and such?
So, and this is a place where, you know, we often think of the scriptures speaking with one voice.
Mhm.
It's my personal belief that what we have in the Old Testament is actually multiple voices, all trying to faithfully, you know, from the foundation of faith, understand the world they live in. And so things like pestilence, famine, you know, some people in the Bible saw these as punishments from God.
Right.
Others saw them as the natural consequence of not being faithful to God. And so for many of the biblical authors, there was this principle that if you don't, you know, follow God, if you don't love God and serve God and worship God, then you don't get God's protection. And so the natural consequence of, you know, idolatry
Mm.
and sin is bad things happening.
Right.
And in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew mind, in the ancient Hebrew world, it wasn't as though God was like making it happen. It's just that it was the natural consequence, right? It's what happens.
Right.
And so, you know, there's different ways to address those problems when they arise, and often the Hebrew people saw those as a reason to return to faith.
So there again, there's that reconstruction motif where they have to restore faith.
Exactly. You know, and this was in a time really before modern medicine. And so if you got sick, you know, the natural conclusion of all ancient peoples, not just the Hebrew people, but Babylonians, Egyptians, you know, if you got sick or hurt, the natural conclusion was you had done something wrong. There was a pretty strong connection between morality and the natural order. And so if you did something immoral, it affected the natural order, and you could get sick, or it could cause a famine or something like that. And so the solution is to be faithful. Now that's a hard place because these days, even we, you know, modern Christians don't believe that God causes famine or drought or hurricanes or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But but I think what we do believe is that if we are faithful, if we know that God is with us, that God can help us get through those things.
We've had more than 500,000 deaths in the U.S., millions globally. How is the understanding of death in the Old Testament? How can that inform us today?
Yeah. Yeah, this is a great question. You know, the Old Testament, for the most part, takes a pretty different perspective on the value of human beings than we do.
Right.
It was a very kind of communal culture. And so the focus was less on the survival of individuals and more the survival of the nation or the clan or the family. But still, the Bible takes a pretty dim view of unnecessary death. The idea that the human action causes death is a major problem that the law of the Old Testament tries to deal with. And so here's an example of that. You've probably heard Old Testament law described as eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, right?
Right.
Jesus refers to it that way. But believe it or not, that was actually, though it seems barbaric to us, it was actually meant to be a control on systems of revenge in the Old Testament.
Try to regulate that.
Yeah. So before eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, if someone, hurt you in some small way, you might rush out and kill them.
Sure.
And so part of what the Old Testament is trying to do is just say, no, you can't go to extremes. Human life is valuable, and retribution or revenge has to be just. It has to be equal.
Right.
So there is a move in the Old Testament toward value of human life. It's not at the same place we are. And this is why I think it's important to read the Old Testament in its ancient context. Old Testament law, though it seems draconian to us, like medieval even, was actually fairly progressive for the time.
Sure.
Does that answer the question?
Not entirely. What I was trying to figure out is how did the Old Testament people sort of settle up or find peace with death? How did they come to terms with it when they see loved ones perish? What did they do to deal with their grief? And how did their relationship with God inform their reactions?
Yeah. So in the Old Testament times, the way they worked through their grief was through lament. And this is why the Psalms are largely lament. They cried out to God. They expressed their anger and frustration at their loss to God. The ancient Hebrews didn't have the same picture of the afterlife that we do.
Right.
And but they still had this concept that some people who were faithful could be drawn up to heaven to live with God. It's not the same vision that we have of heaven. And so, yeah, I mean, there was some reward for being faithful. If you were really faithful, you could get to heaven. But really, they were really focused on living well now. And so, the death of a young person was considered very tragic. But someone who had lived a long, faithful life, that was cause for celebration.
Well, Geoff, we've run out of time. I'm grateful for this conversation to dig deep into the Old Testament as best we can in a short period of time. And thank you for summing up about 7 sermons in 20 minutes. Well done.
Glad to do it. Well, thanks to you, and greetings to the people of Camas, UMC.
Thank you.
Glad to be here with you.
Creator of the stars of night, thy people's